So, welcome everybody. This is the first talk on resilience in this series this year. And resilience, as you know, as Yannick also probably explained, a wide concept used in many different fields. There's a very different meaning in different fields. And so we thought it would be interesting to invite people from very different fields to talk about this resilience. And Yannick is the first, so welcome. Really nice you're here. Yannick got his PhD at the University of Groningen at the Department of Developmental Psychology. And he is now an assistant professor at the VU, the Free University, Vrije Universiteit, in sports and performance psychology. Very different, field than we normally have here. And we're really interested in his talk, and it's exactly on what is not resilience. Go ahead.
Yes. First of all, thank you very much for the invitation. Very thrilled to be here because dynamical systems, complex systems, it's kind of still a very niche group in psychology or social sciences in general. So I'm always very happy to talk about these kind of things or our ideas and perspectives to groups that are very informed, probably much more than I am. As already said, so I have a background in social sciences, psychology specifically, developmental, and then moved more and more towards sports and performance. So I did my PhD in Groningen here in the north, then went to Heidelberg University for my postdoc. Now I'm in Amsterdam, and I'm also affiliated in the United States in Colorado Springs with the Den Hartigh Institute for Human Resilience, where we look a lot at post-traumatic stress adaptations and resilience to traumatic stress, which is again a bit outside of my comfort zone. So I'm trying to play many fields, but the nice thing about this group is they also try to really adopt a complex systems perspective, and this is how they also asked me to join, simply to get insights from other disciplines, analysis techniques, etc. For today, however, I'll strictly talk about conceptual ideas, not really about many studies that we have run. So a lot of papers that we did on really theory and how to conceptualize resilience. Because mostly I feel like when you get out of a talk, you don't remember the analyses anyway, and they differ so much for different applications. So I really will focus more on the theory and really try to figure out what is resilience, what not, and how we are currently thinking about these things. Why is this thing not working really good? No, I don't click like this. No, it doesn't. Well, so first of all, sports is actually an amazing field to study resilience because you have a lot of people that voluntarily expose themselves to unnecessary stresses. That's really one of the main definitions. I mean, even if you just do exercise and train, for example, for a half marathon, like you set yourself these challenges, you train hard, it's physically exhausting, you have sometimes pain here and there, maybe even bigger injuries. And all of these are kind of stressors that you need to adapt to, you need to bounce back from that. Well, here you can see also a very nice emotional reaction. I know it's Germany against the Netherlands, but I think this picture just captures it so well, kind of the emotions that you need to deal with and all the adaptational processes really involved in this. And this is why I think we can learn really a lot from sports where the stressors usually are somewhat minor compared to at least when we talk about post-traumatic stress. But at least I would hope that many of the dynamical principles would be roughly the same, or at least so much the same that you can translate them to different circumstances. So this is why I think, pun intended, but sports is a great playing ground to study resilience. So this is also, for my background, and this is how I usually think about these things. So sometimes when I use metaphors or so, intuitively they make sense to a lot of people in sports. I sometimes even get from my colleagues in human movement sciences now that are really in a quite different group than I used to be in psychology, that when I say, well, we'll talk about this also, how we now conceptualize resilience and what it is, what it isn't, they always come with, but isn't this obvious? This is just, so blatantly clear to them. that in psychology we're still debating with issues and topics, mainly also because we don't really have very good measurement tools in psychology. We often heavily rely on questionnaires, self-reports, interviews, whereas in sports sciences, for example, you have high frequency data with movement analyses, etc., where you can really get into temporal patterns in much more detail compared to what we've been so far able in psychology. Now we have also with smartphones that you can track far more or have shorter questionnaires that you can fill in far more often. So that's why also keep in mind that what we have to work with in psychology is limited in terms of data. And this is also, I guess, why we lag behind a bit in terms of how we conceptualize things. So sports, nice, but resilience, at least in social sciences, well, what is it? Where does it really come from? In the 1950s, what we actually started, way before my time, what was done there is they looked into children that were raised in very adverse circumstances. And they were interested in why some of these children would make it and succeed later in life and others wouldn't. And well, they went around and the typical approach then was to identify these abilities in terms of traits. So they tried to really identify with questionnaires then which children had certain traits or trait-like characteristics that would be able to predict the likelihood of success despite adverse circumstances. And then they came to the term resilience. They developed resilience questionnaires. Ego resilience was the specific term they used to really show that this was a personality trait. And of course, with the prediction of this, it is the more you have of that trait, the greater the likelihood of you to adapt positively to different kinds of stressors. So it was very vague in terms of what is resilience in this case. It is succeeding in life. I mean, that's very rough. And also the way they approach this and measure this was very generic. But this is kind of the idea where we started from. We try to identify children from adverse circumstances and why they would make it and not. So this is important at least to know where we actually came from. Then over the years, we've heavily increased the number of publications. This is social sciences specifically. So the term resilience is coming up more and more and more, which is this a good thing? I would argue not so much for us, simply because we are losing really sight of what we are trying to study. So we started actually with a very neatly defined or narrowly defined group that we were interested in and what the criteria of the outcomes were, no matter how vague. But now that we add more and more things and resilience, yeah, you can sometimes see as buzzwords. I've been to presentations before where resilience was in the title. Resilience was not mentioned a single time in a 45-minute keynote. I had to review papers where there was resilience, sometimes in the abstract. The entire paper isn't about resilience. So it is, for my taste, thrown out there quite a bit, and we are losing a bit of sight what we're actually trying to talk about. So what is currently or has emerged in the last 20-25 years in the psychological literature is very many different ways to conceptualize now and measure resilience. So what are they trying to tell us is resilience? So the first one is very vague. It's just like a general positive adaptation that was seen as, again, mostly children, exposed to events that were statistically associated with traumatic symptoms. And if you wouldn't show them, this also very much relates to the second point, you would kind of resist the potential negative impact of these events, then you would be classified as resilient. However, how they managed to measure this was unfortunately simply just absence of psychopathology after exposure to traumatic events. So you didn't really have a good baseline, so you could not technically not say what the degree of resistance really was. It was just, so we used the so-called DSM, so it's diagnostic criteria, to say if someone suffers from psychopathology. And if you just were not meeting the necessary criteria, then you would not be classified as such. So you could actually technically have worsening in your symptoms, not be classified, and therefore still be labeled resilient in this case. Then we had more of a positive psychology influence, and then it moved very heavily to growing personal assets, your qualities that you would improve after stressors. This was also put under resilience, and well, to have a bit more clearer focus also in the literal translation of the term resilience from Latin resilire would be simply to bounce back, jump back, leap back. So if you take it very literal, we actually want to see a perturbation and a recovery trajectory. You have simple research, very clear research also from stress research on the HPA axis, so that's hormonal levels that you would have at an event that stresses you, increase in heart rate, you would exert cortisol, alpha amylase, some other hormones. And then once the stressor is released, you would return to your baseline level. So you have a clear perturbation, recovery, and that would then be in this field called resilience. So this is more the psychoendocrinology field. So each field in psychology has their different definition of this. So clinical focus very heavily on resistance. Then the more psychophysiological focuses on bouncing back, positive psychology really on growing, but they still always use the same term. And then we have sports psychology, where they said like it can be either of these three, either bouncing back, growth, or resistance. Doesn't matter to us. Basically saying as long as you don't struggle after a stressor, you demonstrate resilience. Of course, this is really tricky. And because what we've then tried to do in the past is, so the abstract here is not necessarily just the title of the paper, I find very telling already. So what we've tried to do, namely, is we tried then to predict with other questionnaires, that's what we do in psychology, try to identify factors that would now predict resilience. So when you have a stressor, we would see how high is your level of motivation, confidence, perceived social support. These are classical psychological factors that would always at least be predicted to have a influence on positive stress adaptation. However, Bonanno here found in an overview that at least for traumatic stress, the research that consistently identifies certain factors like coping strategies is very inconsistent. And for social sciences, it makes sense that if you have the exact same stressor for two kind of different people, they would respond in very different ways. So for example, whereas I would like to tackle the problem right away, another person may first need to cope with their emotions and then try to tackle this differently. So after the emotions have been coped with, you employ different strategies. So the same stressor, especially when they become larger, like traumatic stressors, don't also just ask for a single thing you need to do, but also a sequence of very different things. So even the same person, if we measure them over time, would not use the same strategy to cope to the exact same stressor. So that's why our research, which is oftentimes not longitudinal, rather cross-sectional, and then over an entire group, is very inconsistent. So Bonanno here pointed already to how this looks extremely dynamic and extremely complex, because the things in itself and also the interactions are constantly changing over time. So one factor usually is very unlikely to consistently predict resilience over time. So this was, I think, one of the key papers from 2021 that really just shows that we definitely need different approaches. And well, in line with that, there is currently the consensus, at least in sports psychology, we agree on this, not all domains, that we actually talk about a dynamic process that emerges from interactions. But what the problem is, what we typically do is in our research, at best, when we map something over time, is in psychology, we're often interested in whether something changes over time. So for example, in an intervention study, we have a baseline, we apply the intervention, and we have a follow-up measure. And then we draw a straight line here. And basically, with a simple statistical test, t-test, ANOVA, repeat measures ANOVA, all these kind of things, we assume there's a monotone change, and also that this change, if we find this on a group level, actually works also for each individual. Of course, non-ergodicity plays there a huge role, that this most likely is not working, at least in the exact same way for everyone. Some people may actually go also the other way. So what we're now proposing, a current paper that is now the revisions have been submitted at the beginning of August, so I'm eagerly waiting for the response. But very simply, what we are now trying to tell most psychologists is, what does it mean, dynamic? It means we are actually interested in the change process itself. So how we get from one to the other, we want to know what this process looks like. And this is where I sometimes struggle giving my talk to my colleagues in human movement sciences, because, well, for us in psychology, it's basically a great new idea that if we talk about dynamics, that we map something over time and look at the process, even though we define the concept as a process. So it should be blatantly obvious, but this is not how we do things. And then whenever I'm at the human movement sciences, they just like, yeah, but you even do proper science then if you don't measure the concept the way you define it, basically. So that is really a tricky bit. So we are really trying to shift the focus now away from identifying also these individual factors, which we know are very unreliable in terms of prediction, to really look into the process in of itself, to really get more of an idea of how the dynamics also change over time. So what did we do with my PhD supervisor? Basically, this has a funny story, this paper. My brother, he studied in Delft aerospace engineering. And you can imagine in engineering, you have far clearer concepts, because if you want to put an airplane together and you're a bit vague about your concepts, this may not end very well. So he had his material sciences studies. We talked, it was actually a Christmas dinner, so I talked about my research, and then he said, like, what on earth are you guys doing? If some of you would ever to put together an airplane, I would not want to sit in that thing whatsoever. And then he pointed me actually to, he gave me his textbook then, I took it home and I found this figure in there, it's a so-called stress-strain profile. What they do typically with materials, say a piece of metal, they put force on it, see how it bends and changes, and then they remove that stress usually, and then see up to the elastic limit here, it would also just bounce back to its previous shape. If there's too much strain on this, it would be permanently deformed, it would not bounce back anymore. And so they use this elastic limit, so this bouncing back idea, to define resilience all the way up to this point. So this is quite interesting. We figured like, hey, yeah, we also usually talk about bouncing back. That's basically the literal definition. So how can we use this and translate this to what we can do perhaps in psychology? Of course, I cannot really do a stress strain profile simply because we would need to identify the elastic limit and go beyond that. So that means permanent change. And if I go to the ethics board with that, doesn't work so well. Not even talking about the fracture point in this case. But of course, we then figured, okay, how can we do this for us? Also, there are very precise computations attached to this. So we figured, okay, what do we have? Well, for humans, we can measure over time. So we can use the component of time, have either induced stressors that are milder, but at least we can get at this. So this is just a visual on how that looks like. Golf ball gets run over, but you can see elastic limit is not reached. It just pops back. Even when you hit a golf ball with your clubs, it also actually deforms. That's how much force you typically exert. So this is just a visualization of the resilience process. Okay, so don't mind the formulas. What we just try to do in this paper then is say, okay, we can actually technically also have, if we have a baseline, we know when a stressor occurs. So when we talk about sports, we know, for example, when they have a tough game or very intense training sessions, and then we can see how much they were kind of deviating from their well-being. We can measure lactate and, well, all different kinds of things if we wanted to. And we could technically now see how strong the deviation from the baseline is. And that would give us an idea of resistance. If we now take this a step further and we actually calculate the area under the curve for the return to the previous level of functioning, that could give us an indication of bouncing back. So we can actually, when we have good precise measures, and we can see a perturbation and the recovery trajectory, actually get towards something that is an actual measure of resilience, which is so far lacking. And if you go above the previous level of functioning, then we could get at a measure of growth technically compared to the improvement compared to the baseline. Is this all possible and the greatest solution? I don't want to sell it as such, but at least what we kind of try to move forward is we should try to also perhaps get some mathematical denotations for the process that we are interested in and get kind of at the way how to measure this. So these are just to propose. This could be possible. I'm not hammering down on this is the way it should be done. It's just really for conceptual ideas and moving forward. So why is this interesting to us in the first place? So one thing that we know, it has been also pointed out from colleagues in ecology, from Wageningen, and in clinical findings, what we know, for example, is that depression usually does not emerge from one major life event, but it is a result of an accumulation of stressors within a very short period of time. So what we assume happens is that our recovery is being slowed down, and it takes longer and longer and longer until you hit a stressor that you usually would overcome, but that forces the system, or in this case, your well-being state, to suddenly collapse, and you would have a sudden transition to a lower state. So how we typically think about this, in my eyes, also a vast oversimplification that you have. This is often the picture that you see. It's also taken from one of our papers, so yeah, guilty as charged. That you have, at least according to this model, one healthy state, one pathological state. At the start, they're somewhat equal. Maybe usually the pathological state would be weaker. And then when you have more and more perturbations or stressors, the healthy state becomes eroded. The attractor or basin of attraction decreases, whereas the basin of attraction increases for the pathological state. So for those who are not familiar, imagine you are just a ball and you move under the laws of gravity. So in the top left corner, it would take quite a big push to push you out of the healthy state and over the edge to stabilize in the pathological state. However, now you're starting to have more perturbations, and then the healthy state erodes, the pathological state increases in its basin of attraction, and then the push you would need to get you over the edge is relatively smaller. And once you are really pushed over the edge, you would stabilize in the pathological state. That's why we also have kind of this hysteresis effect. If we wanted to go back, it's not just the exact same force would be required, but a much larger force. This is typically how we think about this. I'll talk later a bit about why this is a bit tricky. But what is now really important to consider, at least from a systems perspective, is, okay, what is the scale and frequency of the measurements that we now need to employ? And that, I think, is something we really struggle with often, because imagine you have an emotional reaction and you have only a measurement point here and here. You would basically miss that dip and recovery, and you could falsely conclude that you actually demonstrate a resistance when there was a stressor occurring, simply because the measurement points that you have missed out on the perturbation and recovery. And if you just have the steps wider, you would have to draw a straight line if these data points available, and then you would say like, oh, we are actually in the exact same state as before, ergo we demonstrated resistance. So when this usually happens is, or at least we are concerned that this could happen when, for example, we only look for athletes, it's typically the population I work with, only at their performance or well-being level. Whereas, for example, their motivation, confidence, and things that are changing on a much quicker time scale, and usually are more on a micro level, these things could actually have the perturbation and show perhaps also already this pattern of slowing down, whereas simply looking at the highest level of functioning, well-being and performance, we would miss early warning signals. Yeah, you could say with Tarkin's theorem, you could see them in fluctuation patterns, but at least conceptually, we are somewhat concerned that if we only look at simply performance well-being, that we miss very important patterns that are happening on more micro scales, simply because we don't measure properly. And this is, yeah, a bit where we find it tricky and well, really urge our colleagues to clearly think about what you want to measure, how frequently it should be measured, what kind of patterns you expect on that level, if you need more levels to look into. So basically, we have to move towards monitoring many variables on different kinds of levels rather than trying to identify some at a single moment in time and try to make proper predictions with that. Then the final point I want to make, I actually don't want to talk more than half an hour, so quite decent in time. So resilience then usually from the idea that as a general positive adaptation was always seen as something positive. However, I personally find that a bit tricky. For example, if you go back to this attractor landscape, if you now define at least resilience as the return to the previous level of functioning, then if you're stuck in this pattern and you're perturbed and you also stabilize in that, technically that is a resilience trajectory. So you would be perturbed, you would return, so you have perturbation recovery. So it is really important to define the level of functioning and what is the desired response that you want to see. So when we also talk again about the golfer, are many of you familiar with golfing? What a slice is? So right-hander, if I hit the ball and I don't rotate my wrist enough, then I would slice the ball like this and it would bend away towards the right. So if this happens very often to beginners, you would want to work on the wrist rotation. So imagine you do this, a coach gives you lessons, in the lessons you do this just fine, but as soon as you go play 9 or 18 holes, you start doing this again. So in this case, your motor system would be actually quite resistant or resilient in this case to these perturbations that the functional, or in this case, functional perturbations that the training was supposed to induce. So if the perturbations are actually functional, and you should learn from this, so student learning is another thing. If resilience hinders learning because you actually want to see an adaptational change to a different state, then this gets really tricky. So again, just because it is very often, it's very popular also in general media, resilience training and 10 ways to boost your resilience and all these kind of things. But yeah, if this at some point gets in your way, because it just talks about stabilizing certain states, then we get into trouble, I think. So again, one more nuance where I think, we should really be careful with our ideas and what we actually want to see, what effects we want to see. So in this paper, we also argue that for human behavior, at least for movement, we should also let go of the 2 fixed point attractors and move to more metastable attractors, simply because when you, for example, even have simple movements like walking, you have interactions or the walking cycle happens on different timescales. So the entire step frequency is rather slow, but you have in this frequency interacting the motion of the foot, putting it down, moving it up again, happens on a much smaller time scale. So all these time scales need to be properly interacting. And this is what we usually then see also in gait pattern. Heart rate has the exact same signature actually, that we don't see a constant mean with random fluctuations, but more of a pink noise signal. So some long-term and short-term correlations in these signals. So it's a signature of multi-level interactions. So we argue this is happening because it's functional. If our walking cycle would always be the same and I would give you a little push, you most likely couldn't adapt. So because if I gave you a little push, usually you would do the step to the side and then bounce back. This is possible because this is not so rigidly defined. So if we want to get into to better ideas how resilience, resistance, and growth probably works, we should let go of this model, no matter how often it has now been published in Science and Nature, because it's most likely not sufficient, at least for explaining human behavior. So we need to also move forward there. Right now, this is just the latest papers we've published, so I don't have really a good idea on how exactly we get there, but I at least have an idea that we should be getting there. And this is kind of it from me already. I hope this was informative, at least on how we do things in psychology. there's challenges we currently have, how we think about these concepts, and how we are trying to move forward within our field. So thank you very much, and I'm curious what your thoughts on this topic are.
Thank you. Well, I think this is sufficiently stimulating for a lot of dynamical systems people. So thank you very much. So yeah, Claudia first.
Yeah, I would like to start with this timescale thing. So suppose that from your sports movement stuff you come up with, you really need to measure at a very high frequency in order to understand whether a person is bouncing back from whatever. So now you have someone who is potentially hit by very bad stressors. You really want to give him an extra stress of measuring himself every 10 minutes? I mean, so where would this end up in practice? How could this insight be used eventually?
Yeah. So that's a very fair question, because filling in a lot of questionnaires is a load on people, and that's what we, especially with people with depression and who suffer from very low energy, asking them, even though we know this would be extremely helpful, but asking them to fill in questionnaires all the time, especially the people at risk, it's just ethically also very tricky. So what I would try to do for many things is, we currently have available tracking that is passive, so you don't need to fill in many things. So for example, for people suffering from depression, for example, we know their inactivity spikes quite a lot, but with just your smartphone we can actually track how much you're moving. So if the periods of sedentary increase and in frequency and duration, then we could also use that as a warning signal without you having to fill in any questionnaires. But for if you want to use questionnaires, there is of course something you need to consider: what is changing on a smaller time scale and what is changing on a larger time scale. So emotions, you cannot capture them because you would have to fill them in every 10 seconds, basically. Whereas,
Which would make me so annoyed.
Me too. As a psychology student, I had to, in my first year, do all these psychology studies. You have to participate in these experiments, and when you had to fill questionnaires for 30 to 45 minutes, how that got through ethics, I do not know. But yeah, it is indeed a massive challenge. So I would try to go for patterns where you really maximally once a day, and just really 3 to 5 items for a person that you really just take out your phone, tap, you fill them in, and you're done with that. And maybe you don't then get at this neat pattern of perturbation and bouncing back, but at least you could get at certain changes in dynamics, increases and fluctuations, or exactly decreases and fluctuations. So when you have mood states, for example, flattening a mood is also a warning signal. So probably getting super neat measures, psychologically speaking, very difficult.
Hartigh, yeah.
I wondered, you basically pointed the need to look at different variables in that slowing down to look at the transition to another state such as depression. But doesn't that lead to the question of how we then define depression? Because could it also be that you are increasingly depressed or increasingly frequently a little bit depressed and so forth and so on?
Yeah, so this picture is basically a very neat, like if you would find that in the data that clear cut, that would be gold.
It would be a model probably.
Yes. I've seen papers where they actually found data as such, but so the sudden transition, it can of course be also creeping in and have a gradual decline and then maybe just a minimal change. So it is sometimes strictly bound to how we define or diagnose depression. So the symptoms would have to be persistent for 14 days. There's at least 5 symptoms you definitely need to have. So technically it could be stated, even if you have the symptoms, but you're at day 13, you technically don't have a major depressive episode, but on day 14 you have. So even though you technically are in this state already, we can't diagnose this.
So are all humans bistable?
Well, I would say multi-stable. I think we have very many different attractors that we can revert
But
to.
in terms of depression, I was thinking, I mean, of course, with injury, I think, that's clear, but
Yeah.
depression, it's
Now,
a bit more complicated.
yes. It's far more complicated, I would say. Yeah, the bistability is. I personally don't like it simply also because this doesn't even allow for growth, unless you define growth as the improvement for the patient of attraction of the healthy state. But as soon as this healthy state becomes problematic, now imagine you have your daily routine, everything is going well, you do basically your Monday, Tuesday, all the way through Sunday, pretty much the same thing, but then you have to move countries. Then all of a sudden, this exact same stable pattern that you've used and was very functional for you needs to be dissolved. But if you're in a very strong attractor state, this becomes very difficult. So just focusing only on stabilizing this one state as a means of improvement, I find that tricky. But from this model, this is what you would derive. So it doesn't really allow for.
What variables make your state? Because if the absence of depression or happiness are in your state, this does not necessarily mean when I drink my coffee, which by the way I never drink coffee. But I would wonder which, like, my habits of when I get up and when I go to work, which may differ if I take a new job or go to another country or whatever, may not be the variables that define whether I'm in a depression or not. So what is then? I mean, probably depending on what you're looking at, you need to think carefully about what to include. I think your example is a bit tricky.
Yeah, it's what you need to include. What really is a good predictor, or changes in what variables are really a good predictor, we are not there yet. So we have some decent ideas in terms of emotion dynamics and mood states, but so far I've not seen a single paper that had more than just a handful of participants where this has been demonstrated with, because I would reckon it's also. Yeah, it's not that it works the same for every single individual. So for example, you will not miss your morning coffee, but if I, for example, move to a country where I can't do sports anymore, or the sports that I want to do, this would have a tremendous impact. Whereas for another person, this may be completely irrelevant. But it's just the thing that sets into motion certain changes, and this is where we hope we find some signatures in time series variables. Well, if you look at the Tarkin's theorem, there should be echoes in other variables from the changes in the dynamics. Does that work? I do not know for at least, injury prediction or depressive states. But yeah, having a single variable, I think, kind of the gold bullet, that won't work anyway. So we need to have a variety of things that we track.
Yeah, then that leads to the next question. How useful is the notion of state? We have defined it by many variables that can also have different combinations of values. You were already referring to metastable states, but that's still sort of statoid, if you like. Is that working then for this kind of system?
Yeah, for human movement, I would say no. We know that this actually doesn't work because simply if you, for example, would throw me a ball and I would already prepare catching, but at the last moment someone tips it, I'm very likely to just reach out and go there. So this state of me going for the catch here, I can dissolve that within milliseconds and just move to another state, so to say. And also that we know we can't actually repeat one movement twice. We cannot do this. The human body, at least most likely, isn't likely to do this. So their states are really just more on a description level. In psychology, we do use them simply because, or where we are somewhat constrained by, is that, for example, clinical diagnosis are also governed by our insurance systems. So we need to have these states in terms of healthy and pathological.
Yeah, I understand. That's what the previous point of the depression points to. But if you don't have states like this, then why stick with states? Because the reason that your resilience definition is developed on having a state at all. But shouldn't be you looking then for another kind of indicator of that something is like for, I don't know, something as simple as a rate of change or a variability or something like that?
So, yeah. But I would, for example, also say when we, let's say at the walking pattern, so if I look at stride intervals, it would show a pink noise signal. But if I have an ACL, so an anterior cruciate ligament injury, so a very heavy knee injury after surgery, we know that people actually have more of a white noise pattern in terms of when they start walking again, and it rehabilitates to a pink noise pattern. So there we can also see the deviation and the return, but I would still use the term state, I guess, to describe the noise pattern that we produce. So at least in terms of explaining it and metaphorically thinking about it, I find it useful, but I see the point that this is indeed very tricky in terms of accuracy of what we're actually talking about.
Yeah, that's actually the problem I'm struggling with.
Yeah.
Estuaries.
Oh, sorry, yeah.
So you mentioned like sport is a good playground for looking at resilience. What sport do you recommend in terms of like abundance of data, and especially naturalistic data as opposed to like bringing experiments? But like I know in like football they track a certain number of things. Other sports track other things. Is there a particular sport that stands out?
The richer the sport, the more data. So the more money is in a sport, the more data you have. It's
Football and cricket.
Soccer, they track everything of these players. So when they come in, they fill in questionnaires, their training is monitored. After that, you even have the entire nutrition plan they have. So everything there is quite under control. Cycling is another one where they really have seen an increase in data. If you're interested in movement data, I would go for rowing. Because it's a cyclic movement. You can also look at interesting synergy patterns with other people, but yeah, it depends on the data quality and what you really want. But if you want a lot of data, then yeah, soccer, cycling, where tracking is easy and often done because the money is available. Let's say in sports like fencing, there simply isn't the funding to have embedded scientists, tracking systems, etc. That's just sad, but unfortunately true state of the sports.
There you were hoping to be studying cloak-seeker?
Just curious as to which sports. I was guessing it's going to be football, but or soccer.
Yeah. Some sports really, you would be surprised. As I said, cycling, they have a lot. Rowing, but it's also because rowing, for example, has a very academic tradition. So there is the desire for science is there larger than other sports. Yeah, and the tricky bit is getting at the data. So if you, for example, talk about soccer, clubs are not always happy to share the data.
I see. And so do you usually like embed with a club or to work with teams particularly? Yeah,
so with clubs, you need to have an agreement with them beforehand. What is now a very hot topic is tracking for women, female players, their menstrual cycle. So because the clubs don't know how to analyze the data, and then you're lucky as a researcher that they come to you. Yeah.
The question over there,
So you presented, I think, your last paper where you said when resilience can be undesirable, and as I understood, you were talking in this context about, for example, resilience hindering you to adapt to new things. But then, this struck me a bit because in my understanding, resilience of ecosystems or also of the human, I understood it more actually being able to adapt to new things. So that this is actually a characteristic of the resilience.
Yeah, so because we now in psychology at least, so that this I think is a very fair point. So I would, for example, use the term anti-fragility for this rather than resilience. So really an improvement after a perturbation. So we look really at a temporal process that marks the perturbation and return to the previous state or baseline. And in this case, it could potentially be that if you look at a higher level of functionality of an ecosystem, that there's just a bouncing back, whereas all organisms within that ecosystem actually showed a positive adaptation, and are therefore more likely to positively adapt or also overcome future perturbations. So this is a bit on what level you're looking at. But for example, what's a good example for resilience? Like just returning to your baseline does not necessarily mean functional adaptation. So that's why I would like to have a different, or reuse a different term for this to make clear this is actually a positive change in the state. So for example, when you have the Lotka-Volterra equations, the predator could still be growing while the prey is already completely eroded. And if they fail to adapt, they would just completely collapse, right? So the entire system would collapse. Whereas for smaller perturbations, yeah, they could just show the bouncing back, but if there's no functional adaptation, then bouncing back actually just stands in their way if they always revert back to the same prey that they go for. So it is a definitional thing, but I would, for positive change in functionality, use a different term and not resilience.
Is it possible that you look at temporary stressors only, like a short snap that happens to someone rather than some permanent stress that occurs? Like, for example, if now near to my house a building project starts and I can't sleep anymore or something like that, this would be not the one thing I bounce back from. So this would maybe require some kind of adaptation, similar with the ecosystem. So that's where it comes to me. Whereas, like maybe, for example, one sharp heat wave, your ecosystem could do something and then next you do the same thing again. But a permanent increase in heat, you need to do something more.
Yeah. The concept I would think about here is, of course, then hormesis, the dose response dynamics, because small dose would always lead to an improvement in functionality typically, and then larger doses. And then if you have smaller subsequent stressors, they could enhance that, but if it's just stretched over a long time, it actually just increases the dose, and then you would have a collapse in the system. Not sure if that helps at all, but
No, I mean, I was just curious whether you only whether my suspicion is correct that you mostly look at short-term things, and whether it would be interesting to expand to look into more
chronic stress. So simply because we are in a luxury position where we can define our stresses quite neatly in terms of training load. For example, we look from training load to training load. We also check with them, usually with the athletes, if they have experienced any other major stressors in their life. But typically, we don't assess them on chronic stress or anything like this.
I have one question also. I go first. That's the privilege of the chair. So, how's the development in terms of conceptual models? You know, in complex systems, usually you try to develop models at a very aggregate scale, right? Maybe here, non-depression and depression, right? Something like this, up to micro models, where you try to look at microprocessors, how eventually the microprocessors emerge, right, from that. Is there any development there? I mean, you could start from only the quantities you measure, right? So this would form then your first ideal state vector. And then later on, of course, the interactions matter, right? How you determine those. But there are many techniques, for instance, machine learning nowadays, where you can detect these interactions from the data. And so you can build these models, right, to make some more conceptual models at every level. So how any development there?
In psychology, not that I would be aware of. There was one study with computer simulations from Van de Leemput et al., also from the Wageningen. Exactly, from that group. We are currently playing around a bit with a model, but it's very basic agent-based modeling, where we actually simulate capacity of a person, resources, and the stressor to see if, for example, stressors are too small, also they lose capacities. And if they are just big enough, not too big, we actually grow in our capacities to cope with, but it's very basic. Initially to show that some mechanisms we can at least show in a model or simulation, but other than this, I only know, but this is very specific on how people collide they use fuzzy models to predict that. Or
But not
avoid
about
it.
emotional and physical interactions, for instance. I mean,
No.
that's something which I would think very interesting, right? Also for resilience.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that could potentially also solve many of the problems, short-term stressors, long-term stressors, if you would model them, because at least from clinical research, we have a lot of indicators also from interviews, etc., how the mechanisms should look like, or at least have a good idea. So it should be possible to build a model, but I at least don't know any groups that are working on this.
Interesting. Yeah. Martin, you have another question?
No, it's answered now.
Oh, okay. Then
Question for clarification. My name is Guus Leijden. Hi. This is a simple model. I like it for states, but well, I have two questions about it. Does the shape of this have a meaning? Is there an analogy? And can the shape be dynamical? Because then you have a different model that maybe you can answer some questions with. If you think of that you can that adaptation maybe is changing that shape.
Yeah, so the tricky bit with this is that so far it's really, in my eyes, more a metaphor, because also from ecology, I've never seen any papers that try to explain how exactly that stressor now changes this landscape, the attractor landscape. It's basically, I think, just a neat way to show there's a positive state, negative, and you could have a sudden transition between them. So I don't know, the shape, so the way it is depicted here, I've never thought very much about the shape per se, but definitely it could be made more dynamic to be more accurate.
Well, the shape says something about the interactions, because the cubic interactions, you get a quarter Hartigh potential, right? And this is where it comes from.
Yeah.
So this it says something about interaction, but then your question is interactions between what?
Yeah.
And that depends on your state vector, how you define that.
Yeah. So what we've done in movement sciences in the past is basically a paradigm on finger wiggling. Don't know if you've ever seen this. So if you try to go in phase or anti-phase now, so they move in the technically opposite directions, right? But if I now increase the speed, you see at some point I'm forced to move to in phase. This happens for almost all kinds of movements that we make. So anti-phase to in phase, this is one of the typical, and this is also the model they typically use several states then, 0 degrees, 360 degrees, 80 and 90 degrees for coordination. You can also try to coordinate at 45 degrees and you can train this, but this is basically, they use the exact same attractor landscape. That's why we, in movement sciences, tend to just copy paste that. But I've not actually honestly spent much time thinking about that this should perhaps be changed. Yeah, it's a very good idea, actually.
I mean,
Sorry for the comment on your question. I think there's a paper on this stable state and the dynamical system kind of for psychological network, more like a symptom network. Paper from Gabriela Linansky from Uber Psychological Methods Group. It's a just wanted to mention there, so something like that. It's a moving landscape.
I mean, just in your picture, you already have a moving landscape, right? Because the landscape has changed, and he was describing how the pathological state based on attraction grows, right? So that picture is missing a dimension, graph or that change.
But the point remains, we actually have no good theoretical point of how and why, to what degree the landscape is changing. I mean, if you start with a very oversimplified model, maybe the mechanisms you would identify with that are then not really accurate anyway. But it is worthwhile at least thinking about what does exactly induce that dynamic change in the landscape.
Any last question? Nobody? Okay. Well,
Sorry. I was wondering, like, what is the temporal scale that you are usually looking at when you have this psychological processes? Is it like a daily changing or like a monthly changing?
We have usually we look at day-to-day changes. There are some studies on emotion and emotion dynamics that take 3 measures a day. So they usually have 30 days to get to 90 measures, or usually ideally to 100. Yeah, so for my purposes and the variables I look at, I also sometimes measure motivation with soccer players. Yeah, they always score 99 to 100 because they're always top motivated when they come to practice. Problem is because their coach sees their data. Obviously, they don't tell me then that they are not motivated to do anything. So there's also some tricky bits, but yeah, there are some studies really with 3 measurements a day, and we just try to do it when they're training anyway. Because compliance is not very high when soccer players have to fill in it in the morning and in the evening when no one is looking over their shoulder.
Mention. Okay, well, thank you very much for this very interesting talk.